Chris, you've talked about fast circuits in Europe. Tell us a bit about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
I went to Indy twice, and I have to say I didn't like the place. I loved the atmosphere there. I loved the history of Indianapolis and everything else, and the people were great. I just, the first year I went, I was in a fairly uncompetitive car, which on the morning of first qualifying had a suspension failure, which put me in the wall. At the time, I was probably running speeds which would have got me into maybe into the top 20. In those days, I don't know whether it's still the same, Bob. You had first weekend qualifying, and then you had second weekend qualifying, and so that was the end of my first weekend of qualifying. And I went. They fixed the car during the week, and I went out, and it felt dreadful. And it turned out, this went on for several days, it turned out that there was a suspension pickup point inside the chassis that was it had been damaged in the accident that they'd never picked up, and the suspension was moving around, and the car was really spooky. And the last thing you want around Indianapolis is a spooky car.
At what speed? At 200 mile an hour?
Well, in those days, we were averaging about 170 mile an hour. I think.
Pretty slow, really.
Oh, shit, yeah, really slow.
So that sort of spooked me out, and I went back in 1970 was the first time McLarens went to Indianapolis, and I'll always actually treasure that month. It was very unsuccessful. Denny who was driving the other one, had a fire going down the back straight, which burnt his hands badly, and he ended up in hospital. I've got to say that none of us knew really a lot about Indianapolis in terms of setting cars up and things. But one thing that month did give me was I'd left the McLaren team at the end of '66 and went to Ferrari for 3 years. But that month of May in 1970 gave me 3 weeks with Bruce McLaren, just very shortly before his death. So it was, I guess I remember that. That's the memories of Indianapolis more than anything else. But I'm sort of lost the theme.
Good answer.
Oh, just Greg, which track did you first debut on in the V8s? What year and what position did you start on? And what's the number 51 about? And why is it so special?
Okay. The 51 it's very simple actually. When I went to Kmart Racing in 2001, that team had been a one-car team. It was the young Holden Young Lions operation, and they had car number 15, and they expanded to 2 cars. They needed another license, and they needed a number to go with it, and it's simply a reverse of 15. That's it. We tried to get 14, and the people who had 14 wanted us to give them $3,000 for the right to have the number. Tried to get 16. I think they wanted $6,000 for that one, and 51 was free. So it's just stuck ever since. I've been trying to get rid of the 5 ever since. It won't go away. I debuted in 1995 at Sandown, but I'd been in Australia for about a year and racing the Formula Holdens, and and obviously to be able to get into the V8 touring cars, or the Group A touring cars as they were known back then, was a goal, and to be able to do the endurance racing. And my first ever drive in a touring car, a V8 touring car, was at Calder Park in Melbourne, and I think it was about May or June, so it was sort of winterish sort of time, and I'd been given a phone call, or been rung up by Jeff Grech from the Holden Racing team, and offered to go for a test. And this is the Holden Racing team. It was like, at the time Peter Brock drove there, and it was a big deal. And I was living in Sydney, and they said, listen, we've got you an air ticket, come down to Melbourne, and and come for a drive. I said, oh, okay, that's fantastic. I was pretty excited about that. Got to Melbourne. For those that have been in Melbourne in May, June, often or especially 10 years ago, the weather was, it's more than that, it's 14 years ago, the weather was could be very inclement, and I got to Calder Park and the rain was horizontal, the wind was blowing that hard. It was about 8 degrees, and Calder Park was very popular for drag racing. They do a lot of drag racing. So the last corner coming onto the front straight comes onto the drag strip. And for those that know anything about drag racing, they put this formula down on the surface called VH. It's a VHT formula, and it generates a lot of grip for the drag racing tyres to work on. But when it's wet, you can't walk on it. It's like ice. So the last corner would come around onto the drag strip, which was like ice, and then you'd head off down the front straight. And it was absolutely teeming with rain. I thought, oh, well, this test isn't going to happen. It's obviously raining, it's wet, and they're not going to, run for the day. I arrive, get out of my car, I come around the truck, get introduced to a few of the guys. The cars were sitting there. They'd warmed car 05 up. So this was Peter Brock's race car. I'd idolised the man for half my life. It had been warmed up, and I said, oh, so, we test, you're not going to test, obviously. He said, no, we're going to test. I said, oh, okay, so who's going out? And they said, you are. And they were giving me the keys to 05 on a day. It was 8 degrees and it was teeming with rain on a track that I knew that was going to be like ice. And my first lap out, I came onto the front straight and I had car 05 pointing at the fence sideways, and that was my first experience in a V8 supercar, and something I'll never forget. I can't have done too bad for the rest of the day because they offered me a drive, and I debuted at Sandown that year with Craig Lowndes as I was his co-driver at Sandown, and we didn't finish. Actually, the first 2 races at a V8 supercar, we didn't finish at Sandown and Bathurst, but we went back 12 months later and won them both, so it was a good turnaround.
Sir, you're our lucky last.
Chris, I'm not sure whether you want to actually talk about this, but can you give us a bit of the background as how the Amon Formula 1 car came about and why it didn't work? And I'll understand if you say no, you can't.
I think probably born out of frustration. I'd really was getting frustrated with the lack of results, and I thought, well, if I can't get it to happen in other people's cars, I'll build my own. And I had a partner, a guy called John Dalton, and to be honest, he put up most of the money. But we were very underfunded, and if you're an underfunded team, what you certainly don't want to do is try and build the most sophisticated car on the grid. And that's exactly what we did. I think it was the first car ever to have the fuel tanks between the driver and the engine. It was the first car that had rising rate titanium torsion bars. It had a lot of sort of things that hadn't been seen before. And, of course, when you go down that track, inevitably the development process is long. I mean, we had a total staff of about 4 people, I think. The upshot of it was that it was underdeveloped at the end of the season. We had a lot of actual design problems with it too. The designer... I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but really some of the basic stuff wasn't very good. And but I'm pleased to say I keep in regular touch with the guy that owns it now, and he runs it in the Masters Series in Europe. And I think Adrian Newey from Red Bull was running in that series in the sports car division. And I believe Adrian's done a little bit of work on the car, and it's actually going very well now. There's a strong suggestion that he might bring it out here, not this coming season, but for Hampton Downs in 2011. So I might get to see it again. I might even get to do a lap of it.
Yeah.
But no, it's certainly not my happiest memory, but I don't actually regret trying it. Had we been properly resourced, I think it could have actually been quite successful.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed listening to these experts and had as much fun as we've had talking to you all. So on behalf of Greg, Bob and Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.